Professor David Bertaina, how much does the Quran really know about Christianity? Does it show actual awareness of the kinds of questions that Christians were asking in its time and place?
Absolutely. I don't think you can say anything else through its knowledge of biblical texts, its knowledge of the Psalms, its knowledge of biblical folklore, of legends, in particular, knowledge of liturgical practices that you would find in the liturgies, for instance, even knowledge of the Eucharist from Al-Ma'idah and so forth. And so I think that if we look at the geography of Arab Christianity and the material in the Quran, I think it's indisputable.
Everyone, I'm really glad to have David Bertaina, who's a longtime friend, brilliant scholar, with us for this session of exploring the Quran and the Bible. Please take a moment really quickly to subscribe to the channel and to like this video. David Bertaina is a full professor in the history department at the University of Illinois Springfield, so one state over from me in Indiana. We're going to put his full sort of professional bio in the description so you can find details and links to his books down below. I did want to kind of just show off a bit one of his more recent books, which we're not speaking about today, but this is an incredible study of a medieval Christian text by someone named Bulis ibn Raja and of his life, which actually solved a major mystery in ways in which something that went on in medieval Europe and the medieval Islamic world with Islamic Christianity, how that was all connected. So that book is Bulis ibn Raja, the Fatimid Egyptian convert who shaped Christian views of Islam. But today we're going to speak principally about, what I think, and I'm usually right about these things, is one of the most, 2 or 3 important articles in Quranic studies in the 21st century. You may not have heard of it before, but if you watch this video, now you can be among those who do know this article and why, it can be mind-blowing, kind of, just put new gas in the engine of Quranic studies. So this is an article entitled Bodily Resurrection in the Quran and Syriac Anti-Tritheist Debates. It was published in the Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association. It's in the volume that is dated 2018, but actually came out in 2020. Since then, this journal, JIXA, has caught up and is got its act together. Okay, so we're going to speak, David and I, about what does this mean? Like, the title, like Syriac Anti-Tritheist Debates. This is within the context of Christianity. Christians are monotheists. Why are Christians debating in Syriac about tritheism? So we're going to circle back to that, which is a really poorly known, but actually very important movement within one current of Middle Eastern Christianity right at the dawn of Islam. But I think, David, it's okay. Let's start by speaking about why this question of tritheism and debates within Christianity might have relevance for understanding the Quran. I'm calling to mind that the Quran has a lot of discourse and counter discourse. So maybe you could just speak about that generally, what are the kinds of accusations that the Quran makes against its opponents? What are the kinds of things that the Quran has its opponents say? This counter discourse where it's paraphrasing for us what according to the Quran, its opponents, accused, for example, Muhammad of saying.
Mm-hmm. I think this is an issue that scholars have dealt with for the past century. I think back to 100 years ago, Richard Bell and Tor Andre were both really interested in how do we talk about a Christian presence in the Quran, because the Quran seems to be interested in a hostile audience, its counter discourse, and to criticize it. And that's continued up through more recent times where we've had scholars such as Patricia Crone has wrote a lot in the 2010s about this audience. And one of the key issues they had with this is that there are 2 commonly argued points that this audience makes in this argument. And of course, the first point that they're going to argue is that God's oneness can be contested. And in this area, we see in particular two passages that become really important for understanding tritheism that are in the Quran, and that's Nisa 4:171, and then in 572, again in Al-Ma'idah. In both cases, we have do not say three, or that they say God is threefold or a third of three in the Quran. So we have a couple instances where God's unity, the Tawheed, is challenged. But what's interesting is that in both cases, the context for the Quranic passage is to refute these
Right.
questions with a Christian audience, or with or using, in order to adduce evidence to argue against them, is to use Christian material. And it seems odd if you were going to argue against a polytheist, they wouldn't necessarily agree with an argument using biblical material. And in the same way, if you were going to argue against a Christian, we typically think, well, of course, Christians wouldn't challenge God's oneness, God's unity. And so that shouldn't be an issue. So that's one of the arguments that was really common, was the issue of God's unity. And so in order to challenge God's unity, these would be challenged with the accusation of shirk, right? These are the mushrikun. These are the ones who are associators, who have associated something else with God. So this is one of the first big issues that scholars really dealt with. The second major issue that we come across is the denial of a physical resurrection of the same physical body at the final general resurrection. And in this case, unlike the first one with the mushrikun, who are accused of being polytheists, in here we have a rejection of them as believers, because they reject a key part of eschatology. And if you reject the resurrection, that has implications for heaven and hell, final judgment, and so on and so forth. So in the accusations that the Quran has here, once again, though, if we look at different passages within the Quran, we find numerous times where the deniers of the resurrection are refuted through the Quranic discourse with examples of biblical characters and biblical stories. And so the problem for scholars historically has been, how do I deal with a question where the counter discourse that we have is one that seems to understand Christianity, understand biblical traditions, not just the Bible itself, but other biblical traditions, and yet denies a resurrection and denies God's oneness. And so we've seen different scholars throughout time come up with ways to answer that question. I think going back from the early 20th century all the way up until today, one of the ways that people have tried to answer what is the Quran really concerned with is to posit that there is this Jewish Christian community, and that has somehow made its way through the centuries down. So that's been one of the ways to respond to that. Another response has been that Patricia Crone's theory that these are monotheist pagans, or henotheists, ones who worship and understand God and the Bible, and yet at the same time they're polytheists.
Right.
So this has been one of the big issues, is that the Quran is arguing against those who it accuses of polytheism, it accuses of being unbelievers, and yet at the same time uses, I think you mentioned kind of this discourse and counter discourse.
Right.
The Azayas has a wonderful book in French on this exact issue. So maybe you could talk about that too, as well as why is that so important here?
Yeah. So let me circle back to both of those issues in the Quran, and say a few things and invite you to respond. So the first issue being the question of the supposed polytheism, or the associating God with other things of the Quran's opponents. So, and you gave us the Arabic term for that, shirk. The opponents from the same term, shirk, are labeled as mushrikun. We have the verb ashraka, all of this in the Quran. I think it's important to note that if you engage with ideas about the Quran and Islam's origins by, say, watching stuff on YouTube, or other stuff on different social media, you may have the idea that it's kind of cut and dry, pretty simple, right? So you might hear that, Muhammad and the Quran came with a message of pure monotheism in the midst of polytheists, and like the Kaaba had idols in it. All of the people in Muhammad's city, Mecca, were polytheists. They had these different gods. I mean, Quran, it's true, in Quran 53 mentions, Alat and Manat and Al-Uzza. Other traditions mention other gods. So you might think like, okay, it's pretty straightforward. It's like, I don't know, Star Wars, maybe, like you have the Empire and you have the Rebels, like clearly different, totally different vibes, right? But actually, when you enter into the Quran, which you do in the Jigsaw article, and examine more carefully the vocabulary, it gets pretty complicated. I mean, one thing is that these mushrikun, these supposed polytheists or associators, they profess belief in one God. They profess belief in Allah as a creator. So there's that. And, as you note, some of the assumptions of the mushrikun, for example, I was reading today with some students here at Notre Dame, in Quran 25, at the beginning, the opponents of Muhammad say, why doesn't he bring an angel with him? Or why doesn't he even bring down a garden from which we can eat? And these assumptions, like angels, heavenly garden, these are kind of sound like monotheistic things, biblical things, right? So, and that's one thing. Maybe I should stop there. I want to add a comment about the resurrection business. But do you want to add anything there, just in response to what I just said?
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I didn't bring up too is that we often see God's unity and the resurrection often appear together. And one of the key points here, though, is that when there are arguments, sometimes just because someone is called a mushrikun or someone is called a kafirun, one is called an associator and one is called an unbeliever,
Yes.
that doesn't necessarily mean there are two separate groups.
Right.
Because, right, we're dealing with two separate accusations of particular theological positions, so we shouldn't assume we know just from that, okay, these are two separate groups. I think it's going to be a lot more fluid as we get into this discussion about this.
Totally. And I think one key sort of theme that we'll return to is the Quran as sort of a text with creative rhetoric. And it's not always kind of simple or transparent to get to what was really said, what really happened behind the Quran because of its use of rhetoric. On the resurrection piece, I just want to give one example, which I believe you raised in the article, which is, famously in Quran chapter 18, at the beginning, the Quran tells the story of the companions of the cave.
Yes.
And the point of the story seems to be the resurrection of the body. I mean, you could explain a bit perhaps, but I mean, it's worth noting that this is a Christian story. I mean, this is the story of the sleepers of Ephesus, which was told, in the 5th and 6th centuries, maybe even earlier, mostly in Syriac, might have had a Greek origin. But I mean, that's interesting that the Quran, in order to tell a story affirming the resurrection of the body, and you specify the same body, but that it turns to a Christian account.
Yeah, I think what that does is tell us something about the discussions that were taking place among Arabic-speaking Christians who were writing in Syriac in the late 6th century, early 7th century, that we have this tradition of the sleepers of Ephesus. As you mentioned, that really one of the big debates is this that comes about is this discussion of how can there be a resurrection of a physical body. In the Quran we have certain, in the counter discourse, the arguments from the audience, we have certain questions. One of them is, will the resurrected body be from the physical body, or will it be a new creation? We have that in Surah 17, in 32, and in 34. So this is a repeated theme we see. And so the Quran is very concerned with this physical body or new creation. And we see this in the Syriac tradition, going back to Afrahat, who's writing in the 300s, in the 4th century. This same question comes about. And Afrahat explains that in the same way that that even if bones turn to dust, God created Adam from dust, and so therefore God can create a new creation from that same body. And it would impugn on God's omnipotence to even suggest that he couldn't do that. And so we see the Quran, interestingly, when the audience asks these questions about is it going to be a physical body, a different creation, that it uses examples from Moses and Pharaoh. It uses examples from David and Sheba. And so we see examples using biblical stories that we also find in some of these earlier Syriac traditions about this physical body or new creation. So that's one example of it, to show that this is a long-standing argument that long precedes the Quran, that we find in the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries. And I think that the debate around tritheism and the response to it by the anti-Tritheists, the traditional Arabic-speaking Miaphysite Christians in Egypt, the Middle East, and up into Anatolia as well, is to use the sleepers of Ephesus to try to argue against this particular idea, which goes back to Origen. The early church father Origen had taught that there would be a new spiritual body that would be taken
from the body that we had during our lifetime.
Yes, exactly. And so anti-Origenism becomes the standard Orthodox position, to reject the idea that there's some other body that is resurrected, but it is this actual physical body. And so there's always all of the different churches of the time are very reticent of agreeing to that. And so the Quran does the same thing. The Quran is also rejecting the idea that there isn't a bodily resurrection.
I mean, this is mind-blowing to me. The insight that one can gain by appreciating these debates, as you said, and I'll explain this a bit more, largely among people writing in Syriac, many of them, though, were Arabs who spoke Arabic during the day but wrote in Syriac. Because, again, one could have a simplistic view of what the Quran is up to. The Quran is monotheistic, believes in the resurrection of the body. The pagan Meccan Arabs, they're all, polytheists, idolaters. They just have no idea, you just die and that's it. That's one way of approaching and understanding the Quran's rhetoric. But when you see that, there was actually this, turmoil or ferment or intense debate going on precisely on the question of the resurrection of the body and the nature of the resurrected body. The point of the sleepers of Ephesus, and consequently the story of the companions of the cave, which appears in the Quran in Surah 18, it's just interesting, right? The point of that story is not just that there's this miracle where these guys fall asleep and are woken up about 300 years later, but the point is, in the Quran says this explicitly, so that you will know that the promise of the hour is true, that you will be resurrected and consequently judged. So you should take the warning seriously. You want to add something there? Or?
Yeah, I was just, for those who are not familiar with the story, should we just quickly go through the sleepers of Ephesus legend? Or
yeah, let's do it in very, very brief form, because I want to get onto tritheism and explain what was this movement among Eastern Christianity.
Sure. Really quickly, the story is about during the time of the Emperor Decius, around 250 AD, and this is before the legalization of Christianity. There is a general persecution of all Christians in the city of Ephesus. Any Christian that is caught will be put to death.
Mm-hmm.
And so these young youths, so teenage boys, 7 of them in most traditions, but in some cases there are different versions of the story with different numbers, which is relevant for the Quran, because the number is challenged in there. These youths leave just outside of Ephesus and go into a cave, Al-Kahf, right? The name of the surah 18 is named after this cave. Then in there they go to sleep. There is a cover put over the cave, and God sets them into a sleep for about 300 years. And when they wake up, Christianity is the state religion. And so they come out, they don't know this, and they go into the city, and they try to buy some bread because they're hungry. But they're using this coinage from the middle of the 3rd century. And so they're recognized as, how did you get this coin? used. Yeah, it's a gold coin. And so they're brought to the bishop, and then they're brought to the local leader, and then it's discovered that these youths have a proof of a bodily resurrection, and so they return to the cave, and then they go to sleep again, this time forever. And then the people of Ephesus build a church over this location. The church, the remnants of it are still there today, so you can go visit the archaeological remains of the Church of the Sleepers of Ephesus. But the fact that this legend gets written down in Syriac, and that the details of it are not the same in various versions of it, tells us that that in the milieu of the Middle East, that there was a strong emphasis using the sleepers of Ephesus to indicate that the physical resurrection does take place against any originist claims, or
Yes.
what we see with the Tritheists, any rejection of a real resurrection.
Yeah, terrific. I mean, your work on, I mean, not only in this particular article, but generally on Syriac and Arabic Christianity. I mean, it's just sort of an invitation to folks who are interested in the Quran, the emergence of Islam. But, you know, there is a tradition, both in the Islamic world and in the West, of just doing the Arabic, you know, the later Islamic Arabic sources and kind of looking back at the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
But when you go back to a tradition like the stories of the sleepers of Ephesus, which someone like Jacob of Sarug, has his own version of in the 6th century, so you know the time around the Quran's origins, you begin to see like, oh my gosh, there's so much more to discover. And I just like to kind of continue a segue from there to the question of tritheism, and there's some work to be done to kind of explain. So tritheism, you know, that term, you know, belief in 3 gods, as you note. The Quran specifically accuses Christians, I mean, more or less seems to accuse Christians of tritheism. In Quran 4:171, it says, "La tuqulu thalatha," do not say 3. Quran chapter 5, verse 73, لَقَدْ كَفْرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ ثَالِثُ ثَلَاثَ. Those who say that God is the third of 3 are unbelievers. So we have those references there. But more generally, we have the question of God's oneness and the affirmation of La ilaha illa huwa, you know, the affirmation of God, there's only one God, is throughout the Quran. You know, it's probably the principal theme of the Quran. Okay, so it matters that there really was a movement just before and during the time of the Quran's proclamation in the Middle East among Arabic speakers. This movement was accused of being tritheistic by other Christians. So there's a debate between Christians, some of whom are calling others tritheists. Okay, I think there's a couple of things we have to say. I'm going to invite you just to speak about, you know, the larger movement, which I'll introduce in a moment. But just reminders for those who may not be familiar with the languages and things. So, friends, we're dealing with, you know, the CE centuries or the AD centuries, you know, 5th, 6th, and 7th traditional dates of Islam's origins. And Muhammad begins to receive the Quran in AD 610. So that's kind of the time. The context is the Middle East. By tradition, Muhammad receives the revelations in Mecca, so the western part of what is now Saudi Arabia. We're interested in kind of the larger scope of the Middle East, and there are Arabic-speaking Christians, you know, in a pretty wide range. You can, and maybe David add more detail on this, but, you know, for example, there are Arabic-speaking Christians in what is now Syria and what is now Jordan, Palestine. They're coexisting with other Christians speaking other languages, principally a language called Syriac, which is a Semitic language related to Arabic and Hebrew, but a few speaking Greek as well. And it's just important to note, at this point, before Islam in the 6th and early 7th century, Arabic speakers, so the Arabs who were Christians, they were not writing their texts about Christianity in Arabic. They were writing their text principally in Syriac, you know, just like, I don't know, like a German or a Swede today at home will be speaking German or Swedish, but when they write an academic article, they would do it in English because everyone's writing in English these days. Okay, was that okay? And what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I would have said to help contextualize this. And we need to understand that at this time, there are three principal Middle Eastern Christian groups at the time. They're known as the Melkites, Jacobites, and quote unquote the Nestorians, or the Church of the East. The Middle Eastern Christians are called Jacobites, but the umbrella of them is the Miaphysites.
Yes.
So the
Okay.
Miaphysites includes not only.
For us, this is going to be the really key Christian community, right? The
Yes.
Miaphysites.
Yeah. So the Miaphysites includes Coptic Christians,
Mm-hmm.
Nubian Christians from what's today Sudan, Ethiopian Christians from the Kingdom of Aksum, Christians in Yemen, and especially for those who are familiar with the story of Najran, which appears in the Qur'an, or at least allusions to it. They're also common all the way from northern Arabia, all the way up into northern Syria, up into Palmyra, and they're found in Sinai and Petra as well. But this also then includes um, Aramaean people, so Syriac speakers who are also not of Arab descent. But it's this Miaphysite community, specifically the Jacobites, Syriac speakers those who are Arabic speakers, but also writing in Syriac,
Yes.
who are
Yes.
found all around the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula, all the way down into Yemen, and then all the way up into Syria. They are the ones that are the most important because they are the ones that undergo this debate about tritheism.
Tritheism, and it's a very significant slice, maybe slice it doesn't work with very significant, but it's very significant Christian community. We're not talking about like, I don't know, one village, one tribe, something like that. I mean, in fact, it's probably for another conversation, but in some ways, the Byzantine Empire, this is a constant headache for the emperors, that you have mass numbers of Christians before Islam within the Byzantine Empire who are not so-called Melkites or Chalcedonians, but who instead are Miaphysites or Jacobites. So, you labeled all of the groups. And yeah, I mean, we're going to get right into tritheism among, or so-called tritheism among the Jacobites. But just to kind of maybe sum up here, so we're dealing with the origins of Islam. There are three major kind of families of Christian communities: the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, sort of officially Melkite, but then the whole region that's closest to Mecca in Medina is above all Miaphysite. I mean, you have some Melkites around, I guess, in Alexandria, Jerusalem, stuff like that. But I mean, more Miaphysites than anything else. Is that fair?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and that's going to be really critical because, as you note, very close to Islam's origins, we have this controversy among Miaphysites. So we not only have fighting between, Melkites, so-called Nestorians, and Miaphysites, but then this controversy emerges, and I'm just going to read a bit here, if that's okay. Did you want to say something before I do?
Just that to understand this context, I mentioned that the split between the Miaphysites and the Melkites happened with the Council of Chalcedon, but really this debate continues in the 6th and 7th centuries. The Byzantine emperors are still trying to reunite the Miaphysites and the Chalcedonian Orthodox together. So they're still trying to put their empire together, because unity of faith means unity in terms of political power and military power, and so the Miaphysites are constantly courted by the Byzantines, and this goes even, as I mentioned, in 542, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian even allows, with his wife Theodora, who's a Miaphysite herself, allows for two Miaphysite bishops, Jacob Baradaeus and Theodore of the Arab tribes, to go and evangelize in the Middle East to help improve the relationship, but also to allow the Miaphysite communities to grow through this act of goodwill. And so Jacob and Theodore actually get eventually into this controversy over tritheism
Very
later on.
interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting. I can think of some parallels also with as Islam develops and the notion of unity. I mean, Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah among Sunni Islam. Okay, so you write in your 2018 Jigsaw article on page 54, but in 557, according to the Chronicle of Elias of Nisibis, a Syriac-speaking Miaphysite, sorry, let me enunciate that properly. According to the Chronicle of the Lives of Nisibis, a Syriac-speaking Miaphysite from Apamea named John Muqaddezeka, his name probably doesn't matter that much, let's just call him John, although another John will come into our story later. So this guy, John, he began teaching that there were not only three hypostases, that is, Father, Son, and Spirit, in God, but also three distinct divine substances or essences. This doctrine was labeled tritheism by its opponents. Okay, could you explain that a bit for us?
There is what's known as the Fifth Ecumenical Council. This is where the Byzantine Emperor called together the Chalcedonian Orthodox and the Miaphysite Oriental Orthodox together to try to reunite. And at this point, they begin to rehash how do we explain God's unity and the natures of Jesus Christ. So in the 6th century, Christians are continuing to debate this. And so right in the wake of this, John decides to talk about this idea that if we speak of God, we are speaking about God in reality. And if we are speaking about God in reality, in terms of hypostasis, can we also say that we are talking about God in three natures? And if we say God is three, and if we have three hypostases, can we also talk about three natures in reality? And so what he begins then to do, using Greek terminology of ousia, essence, as well as nature, that if God is three, then we should also talk about Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as three in reality, and not just as a mental abstraction. And so Tritheists argued that if we speak in reality of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, then God must be three in reality as well. And if we speak of Trinity, if we speak of God's oneness, we're only using a mental abstraction. In other words, it's a theological concept, but it's not a reality. And so the idea here is that language means something. And so if we say God has three natures, or if God has three essences, then God is three. God is, we have to say three. We cannot say otherwise. And so their argument becomes later on is if we say that God is one, then essentially we've also created a quaternity. If we say God is one, then we've created a fourth. There's God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and God as one. And so you can't create a mental abstraction without it being also real.
Yeah, so it seems like, and this is a point you raise in the article, that the approach of someone like this John, I guess his name in English literally means high boots. Is that right?
High boots. Yeah.
It's like someone's handle on a video game or social media.
Yeah, or maybe John of the Galoshes or something like that. He's got, I don't know.
So, I mean, you make the point that for someone like John, and I think some of the later so-called tritheists who we'll speak about in a moment, they're coming at the question from a philosophical perspective. And I mean, your description that you just gave us sort of illustrates that, right? Because the testimony of Scripture is clear. I mean, throughout the New Testament, and not only the New Testament, but the creed which all Christian movements affirm, which is a creed of Nicaea. So the statement of Christian doctrine, Nicaea, begins with the belief in one God. So that's important to point out, right? That they're not sort of, theology usually is done by starting with Scripture and tradition, and then trying to sort that out intellectually. But they're kind of starting with the intellectual business.
Yeah, and so what that does is you might think if it's a philosophical dispute, perhaps this wouldn't have relevance for some person who's on the periphery of the empire, who's in an agricultural, smaller rural area, that perhaps that it doesn't. But what we find is that this debate immediately becomes important within the Arab communities. Mm-hmm. So I remember I mentioned that the Emperor Justinian allowed for Miaphysite bishops to be ordained and then to start to evangelize in the Middle East. They were sent to the leader of the Arab tribes. His name was Al-Harith ibn Jabala,
Mhm.
and he was of the Jafnid branch of the Ghassanid Arab tribe, so of the Ghassanid tribal confederation. He ruled from Jabia in Syria,
Mhm.
basically all the way up from Palmyra down to Sinai and Petra to this area. And Al Harith ibn Jabala was the one tasked with facilitating Jacob and then Theodore, who, if you guess by his name, Theodore of Arabia, Theodore of the Arab tribes, whose task was to encourage Miaphysitism among the different Arab tribes throughout his region. This
Okay.
would have been in present day Lebanon and Palestine, Israel, Jordan, down into what's northern Saudi Arabia.
Mhm.
But
In the
what's
sixth
also
century, right? So this fellow Al Harith dies in 569.
right, he rules from 529 to 569, so 40
Okay.
years he's in charge.
Wow.
So he is a powerful, long-lived leader, and so he exerts an immense amount of influence.
Mhm.
But what this tells us is that he also becomes the arbiter of theological disputes among Arabic speakers. So when there are debates, people, bishops, and monasteries are accountable to this Arabic speaking leader.
I mean, some people will say, wait a second, Professor Bertaina, I thought that the Arabs before Islam, they were pagans. Like, I've seen stuff online, they were pagans. Other peoples had, monotheistic prophets. There were the people of the book, but those were like some other ethnicity or language group or something. The Arabs were pagans. But you're telling us that not only were there Arabic speaking Christians, but there was like a whole culture of debate about God and the resurrection among Arabic speakers in the 6th century before Islam.
Right, just in the decades preceding that. And we should also think, too, when we think of Muhammad, that we think about the Qur'an in the tradition starting in 610. But of course, that doesn't discount, of course, his entire upbringing and experience as a young man and
Mhm.
what would he have encountered during his lifetime. So we can certainly talk about things in the late 6th century as things that would have shaped the experience of Arabic speakers prior to the emergence of the Quran as well.
Right, right.
I think that's really important. But
Yes.
we know, as I mentioned, in this time, the provinces of Syria, Phoenicia, Palestine, Arabia, all of those are controlled by the Arabs. Al Harith ibn Jabala was given the title king and patrician. So he was given the title of a Roman patrician, and he
Mhm.
was given the title king of the Arabs by the Byzantine emperor. So he had a high level of autonomy over this area right here. And the reason for that was because the Ghassanid Arab tribe was responsible as a buffer state between the Byzantines and the Sasanian Empire. And then the Nestorian communities
Persians.
provided the same on the other side for the Sasanians.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so, to what extent would these Arabic speakers have been involved in not just politics but theology? Well, we have examples of this. Al Harith's son Al Munzir also succeeds his father and continues his policies and gets involved in a lot of these tritheist issues. And in fact, we know that this is very, very long standing. In 523, there is a massacre of Arab Christians in the city of Najran, and there are two accounts of that we know of, and this is mentioned in the Quran in Surah 85. The first 9 verses are
By,
said to
by
have been
tradition, this is Ukhdud, right?
by tradition that it's a reference to it. Yes, there are two accounts of it written. One is the Book of the Himyarites about Himyar, which is the name for what's today Yemen, for the South Arabia. And then there's another account by Simeon of Beit Arsham. What's interesting is that Simeon was a diplomatic envoy to South Arabia from the Arab leaders in the area, so right by Al-Harith's predecessor. So what that tells us is that they were already exerting influence through embassies and diplomatic exchanges with South Arabia in the 520s. And so it's not surprising that these connections that would have traveled through Yathrib, through Mecca, would have been taking place
Right.
during this time in the 6th century. And so we would have seen these exchanges among the Arabs who were concerned about, among their fellow Miaphysites, about what are we thinking about? What's going on? And in fact, one of the most important things we have, I can bring up later again, or we can talk about more, is that in 567, Al-Harith ibn Jabala, this is 2 years before he dies, writes a letter, an encyclical, out to all leaders among the Arabs. And he says there's this troublesome doctrine we find among the Arabs of tritheism. And we find that many people in our community are adopting it, and we need to put an end to it. So we know that the Arabs were already concerned in 567 with a particular group that was denying God's unity, that they accused of saying three, and that they were denying the resurrection.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Okay, so, and it's important to make the point here that this, obviously, I mean, if Al-Harith is writing about this is a real threat. You know, it's not just because you have heresies sometimes, both with Islam and Christianity, where it's really just one guy, like one guy saying some stuff, and like, you know, the guy kind of cataloging heresies might make it seem to be more than it really is. But this really is something, because not only Al-Harith is writing about it, but you know, around this time too, I guess the emperor now in Constantinople is Justin II or Justinian II. Mm-hmm. And he, you know, this is from page 55 of your 2018 Jigsaw article. I'll just read a little bit. 2 years later, in the hope of effecting a reconciliation, the Byzantine emperor Justin II called for a meeting between the Chalcedonian, so the Melkite patriarch John Scholasticus, and the leading Miaphysite bishops, and the foremost so-called Tritheist bishops, Eugene of Seleucia and Conon, I don't know if I'm saying that right, of Tarsus. And then it doesn't work out. Now I'm paraphrasing. I'm no longer quoting. Doesn't work out. And the emperor himself, Justin II, issues condemnations against the Tritheists in 567. And I mean, your narrative goes into the details what happens next. But I mean, the emperor is concerned with this.
Yes. And Al-Harith, after that, he is the one who's tasked with exiling Conon and Eugene and sends them into exile for 3 years, where they're at a monastery where they're not supposed to write or have contact with other people. So it's the Arabic speakers who are exercising political authority and theological authority over this particular issue of people who are making these sorts of claims against God's oneness and so forth. So and what's interesting is that, remember, that they're writing these texts in Syriac, although they're Arabic speakers. And we're very lucky because Jean-Baptiste Chabot was able to get a manuscript of all of these 6th century collections of writings produced by the scholars and the scribal community under the Arab leaders. And so we have this nice collection of them all in Syriac, but from the Arabic speakers. So it gives us a nice chronological history of what was going on, what were they concerned with, and this pops up again and again. These syndocticons, these and anathemas, these excommunications of these particular groups. So the Arab leaders, and we see also another example is in response to these anathemas, we see declarations by the monasteries in the Middle East. And when we look at the names, some of the names are in Greek, some are Syriac, but some are Arab, where they affirm their faith in the Miaphysitism and against Tritheism.
All right, we have a couple more things to do. Everyone has to stay with us. Everyone, this is already good, and it's going to get better because we have to get also to why the Tritheists also had this doctrine that was criticized about the resurrection of the body. We need to get to who I think is maybe the key player, which is the other John Philoponus, in a second. But I have kind of a weird but maybe interesting comment. We were actually speaking before the recording, just randomly, because I was telling you about something I did last summer. I took some of my kids to visit some of the sacred sites of the Mormons in upstate New York. Mm-hmm. In the U.S. And it was just a random reference. We were just sharing, getting caught up with each other. But, so the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints, I mean, there are kind of vague parallels here. Obviously, it's not causation or anything, it's just kind of coincidence. But when you look into early 19th century American history, the Mormons appear first in upstate New York, keep moving westward. But this caused a lot of like turmoil in the American religious scene, principally among Protestants. There weren't that many Catholics yet in the U.S. And there's stuff about polygamy and other things that caused trouble, even with Joseph Smith himself. But also their doctrine on God, which, I mean, I don't want to say something wrong because I'm not an expert, but I don't know. It's been accused or characterized as tritheism. And then there's all these social problems, right? Where like keep going, out to Illinois, Missouri, finally out to Utah. All sorts of violence against the Mormons. The movement splits. Some stay in Missouri, I guess. I don't know. It's just interesting. Like in that case too, there's the theology, but there's the real, like on the ground social or even political thing.
Right. And when we look on the ground, it's not just the elite in Constantinople or Greek speakers. It's the Arabs, and it's in their monasteries and so forth.
Yeah.
And I think there's a good case that that this is a concern all the way throughout the Arabian Peninsula too, and not just in the northern Middle East. Yeah.
So if the time's right, I'm sorry if I cut you off. You can finish your thought if you wanted to keep going. But then could you introduce us to this key player in the whole tritheism debate, John Philoponus?
Sure. So John Philoponus he's also called John the Grammarian. He's a writer in Alexandria. He's a Miaphysite. After the ecumenical council, he writes a defense of Miaphysitism. It's still considered an example of the Miaphysite doctrine even today. But later on in his career, the following decade, he begins to write about the idea of God as three in nature and essence, and therefore in reality. And so God is only one in terms of a mental image, but not in reality. So John gets criticized for his writings, but John, because of his popularity, his works immediately get translated into Syriac, and so they start to get spread throughout everyone who's reading Syriac as well.
He wrote in Greek.
He wrote in Greek.
Translated into Syriac. Arab Christian thinkers and political leaders like Al-Harith, they're used to dealing with Syriac, even though they spoke Arabic.
Exactly, and so they're reading this, and so John's teachings become quite influential. And then in his discussion of his treatise on the Holy Trinity, that's the key work where he begins to move away from this. And then the second thing that John does is that within John's community, we have a rejection of the physical resurrection and a return to the idea that there is a spiritual body. And so the idea that this resurrection then is a new spiritual body is seen as tantamount to a rejection of the entire resurrection by their opponents, the anti-Tritheists. And I think this is really important because if we're going to connect to the Qur'an, in order to understand some of the Quranic things, we need to understand anti-Tritheism. How do they critique John for his doctrines? And so what are they saying about it? And so we shouldn't necessarily assume that what anti-Tritheists are saying is accurate, but we might think of them as caricatures of the arguments that these communities are making. And so because of that, we see a lot of the anti-Tritheist arguments doing things like saying, let me give you an example. In 567, there's an anathema of John Philoponus. The anathema says, we find that which is written by John the Grammarian, who is called Philoponus, but rather should be called a heretic, to be full of unbelief. We anathematize whatever is written on this subject by John the Grammarian, who is surnamed Philoponus. However, more truly speaking, an unbeliever and anyone who receives his writings. We also anathematize John the Grammarian and any clergy who would give him communion before they would do penance on account of this matter. So we have anathemas accusing him of being an unbeliever for having postulated these kinds of ideas.
So if they were writing in Arabic, they might say kafir.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I follow up on that a bit?
Yeah.
First of all, did John Philoponus call himself a tritheist?
No, what he does is his writing, he calls it on the Trinity. So he still sees himself as a Trinitarian Christian. Um, but in his own writings, he says, I'll just quote from John. He says, "The oneness of the divine essence and nature is subsequent to the constitution of its being, so that this unity is merely a mental image and comprehended only in the sense of imagination." So he does consider himself a Trinitarian, but at the same time, he would not call himself a tritheist, nor would he say that he denies the resurrection.
Okay.
But the anti-Tritheists will.
Before we get to the resurrection, it's probably an impossible question. It's a Kobayashi Maru for Star Trek fans. But I mean, in your opinion, did the so-called mushrikun mentioned in the Quran call themselves mushrikun?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I'll have to say I don't want to make a wrong answer and feign
I mean,
knowledge over it.
it's impossible to verify any answer because we have nothing from them. We only have what the Quran says about them. But it seems to me a pejorative term, mushrik.
Yes.
I mean, maybe I'm influenced by the way it's used, but it just seemed like who would call himself a mushrik, you know? So, and the point, I mean, my point in asking that impossible question is just say maybe there's something similar going on, right? So the first case is the Miaphysites and the Melkites criticizing a faction whom they are calling tritheists.
Yes.
And then the second case is the Quran, Muhammad, criticizing a faction or a group whom he is calling mushrik or mushrikun. Do you see what I mean? Like, we shouldn't take at face value that a hostile or pejorative a name is in fact how the people so named would represent themselves.
Exactly. That's part of that discourse, counter discourse that you were discussing earlier, how there is a tendency when we want to describe our opponents, and this still happens in politics as well,
Exactly.
that you want to caricature their views, you want to polemically attack them.
Everyone who disagrees with me is a Nazi.
Yes, we hear that a lot. That's right. Everyone just seems to go there right away. Like, we're not going to nuance this at all. We're going to find the easiest path. The other thing is that anti-Tritheists do this, and we find this in the Quran too, is that they have a tendency to flatten out history and context. Because if you tell the history of something and you give it a theological context, then you have to explain this. And anti-Tritheist literature sometimes delves into that, but I think on the ground in oral discussions, oral debates, they're not going to get into that. So you want to flatten it out into the simplest terms possible. And so the argument I make in my article is not that the Quran is arguing against tritheists necessarily, but it could be, very well could be, but that the patterns that anti-tritheists use are the same patterns we find in the Quran of reducing an opponent to the terms that fit my particular polemical interests.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to go even further. I mean, I'm so convinced by the importance of your arguments and the geographical and chronological proximity between this so-called tritheist movement and the Quran's origins. I mean, I think maybe it's even more than sort of parallels in theological argumentation, and actually the very debate itself was felt in Mecca. Let me read another bit from your article, which I think is important about the question about rhetoric. Okay, so this is page 66. You write, in an anonymous Miaphysite question and answer text, there are 11 questions asked by a tritheist, along with solutions given by the author. So the tritheist is a bad guy, the author is answering him. The exchange, which took place in Syriac, was entitled, so this is the title of the treatise by some Miaphysite who's not a tritheist or so-called tritheist. The title of the treatise is A Refutation of the Questions, slanderously written by one of those who have fallen into heresy, confessing that the holy, inconsubstantial Trinity is composed of a plurality of substances and natures, which produces pagan polytheism. And now you give us in the article, and I just want to mention here and ask you to explain, the original Syriac for
Yeah.
the term pagan polytheism, right? So this Christian Miaphysite is accusing his opponent of pagan polytheism, which in Syriac is Sagiuth Elahutha Dahanpe. So
Yes.
multiplicity, Sagiuth Elahutha of gods, of Hanpe, of pagans, I guess. I don't know if you want to add something to all that or.
Sure. Yeah. So we often find that term, the accusation, the anti-Tritheist literature accuses them of being Hanpe, of being pagans, of paganism. And the other one is the other Syriac term you mentioned is somebody who ascribes to polytheism, which would be Sagiuth Alahe, multiple gods. And then Sagiai Alahe would be a polytheist, polytheists. And so we find examples of sometimes they're being accused of polytheism, sometimes of pagan polytheism, sometimes of paganism. What's interesting with the word Hanpa, there's been a lot of ink spilled over the question of this, of course, is that one of the interesting things is that the word in the Syriac Hanpa has often been seen as, okay, a pagan. But if you get back to the Arabic root Hanaf, where Hanif comes from, Hanpa, to be a pagan, usually was used as a negative term. If you're a Hanpa, you're a pagan. But if you go back in earlier times, a Hanpa could be anyone who turns away from something. So in earlier writings, you might find non-Christians accusing Christians of being Hanpa, those who have turned away from the gods.
Mm-hmm.
And so perhaps what we see here is that this sense in Hanpa of pagans is used negatively among the Syriac anti-Tritheists. But in the Quran, where you have Hanif, a Hanif is someone who has turned away from the gods. Abraham turns away from them. So perhaps there is some connection there, but they don't use this term in the exact same way. So that's one thing. One challenge is that Hanpa is used negatively in the anti-Tritheist literature, and Hanif seems to be used in a little bit of a different way in the Quran.
Right. But despite that, that this term is, I think more than once comes up in the anti-Tritheist Christian Syriac writings and is prominent in the Quran, and that Abraham so frequently associated with this term as a Hanif. I think that's important. Okay, let's touch on one more thing before we call it a day, because you mentioned for us that generally the Tritheists are accused not only of tritheism, but also of denial of the resurrection of the body. But then you said, especially John Philoponus is remembered for arguing something that was attributed to accurately or inaccurately, I don't know, Origin, I guess 3rd century, right? 3rd century Christian, so centuries earlier. But that, John Philoponus came back and said, I accept that there is a resurrection. I even accept that we will have a resurrected body that will, consequently experience either, beatific vision, communion with God, or punishment. But then I guess he said that the resurrected body is not actually the one that we had in this life. Is that right?
Yes.
And then, why is this such a big deal? What's the problem here?
Yeah. Really quickly, before I get into that, I want to say one last thing about this. There is an anathema against John Philoponus and his work on the Trinity, where they say, let any opponent be anathema who says 3 gods. And then there's a quotation from John Philoponus where on the Trinity, where he says, if we do not say 3 gods who are different in nature and so off. So he said, there's a necessity for us to say 3. And of course, when we think of the Quran, immediately we think of do not say 3.
Right.
And in fact, we find John Philoponus in a passage saying, if we do not say 3, then we would not be accurate in these statements. And then a response, an anathema, do not say 3. So I think we see some interesting parallels there too.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. Good point. Yeah.
So in terms of the resurrection, though, we find that this particular group finds that anti-Tritheists find their teachings that the physical body will not be resurrected is tantamount to a complete rejection of the resurrection altogether. And so they talk about this particular group, and they reject it as and they say they should not be considered Christians. And so we have examples of the Monophysite patriarch of Antioch, Paul of Beit Ukame, writing a rejection of them as even being considered Christians for suggesting that there isn't a physical resurrection. There's also an interesting piece, which is a anti-Tritheist critique of the doctrine of John Philoponus from the very end of the 6th century. That not only does it say for rejecting the resurrection, about the fact that the souls will rise again, just as they have taken part in the sorrows and labors here, they will share in the possessions and they will be punished with them there in eternal life.
Wow.
So we have a connection of denying resurrection or denying a physical resurrection with eternal punishment. And that punishment is very physical and real and tangible punishment, not a...
The Qur'an, this idea is all over the Qur'an. So, the threat of burning, all the descriptions of suffering in an-nar, in the hellfire. Yeah.
So we find anti-Tritheist literature making these same accusations in the late 500s of people among Syriac writing Arabic speakers in that community. So we also find other examples in John of Ephesus, not to be confused with the other Johns. Here's our third John, who wrote about the Monophysite controversies. And he also mentions people who promoted the denial of the resurrection among the Tritheists and who went out and evangelized within the communities in the Middle East. So in what's today Syria and Jordan and so forth. So we know that this was very concerning among Arabic speakers and the political leaders and the historians and so forth.
I mean, one can see again that there's a fundamental theological principle at stake where, and there's probably not time to get into it too much, but, folks who are against the so-called Tritheists would say, listen, Christ rose from the dead. The scripture itself, along with the Council of Nicaea, affirms the resurrection. I know this is an intellectual challenge. How can it be? But this is the faith given to us by Christ. Whereas someone like maybe John Philoponus, would be like, well, let's think about this. Like, how could you really have the same body, which is contingent maybe to time and space and stuff, or some way imperfect? So, yeah.
Absolutely. And of course, and the way that the anti-Tritheists try to counter this is by promoting not just this literature, but legends like the sleepers of Ephesus as a way to promote the physical resurrection. And so a lot of these anti-Tritheist arguments, specifically connecting denying God's oneness and denying the resurrection together, and accusing them of unbelief and accusing them of being associators and of using things like the sleepers of Ephesus, all of those patterns, we see similar movements in the Qur'an's response to its audience. Brilliant. So I find that really compelling and worthwhile for those who work in the Qur'an to look into more deeply.
Yeah, awesome. Incredible stuff. Friends, Professor David Bertaina, is professor at the University of Illinois Springfield, written lots of things, a great book on debates, kind of the fundamental book on debates between Muslims and Christians in the early Islamic period. In the article we've been discussing, we go back to the pre-Islamic period. That we'll have a link to it below. It's in the Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association. Remember this book too. It's not exactly on Quran and Bible, although it comes up a bit. So maybe we should have another discussion on this book. Incredible contribution, like equally groundbreaking, I think, to the Jigsaw article. But that'll be for another time on Bulis Ibn Raja. David, great. Thank you very, very much for being here.
Thanks so much. All right, appreciate it, Gabriel. Until next time.
Thank you.